time for Labor Day weekend. And if you notice something about these reports, Republicans will go on TV and say these jobs numbers are terrible, horrible, the economy's in the tank. And then Joe Biden goes out and gives a speech saying we got the strongest economy in the world. This is the best jobs report ever. Why isn't there just objective reality about these things? And there was another curious thing about this jobs report. Well, I'll ask our guest, Brandon Arnold. He's the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. And did you notice, Mr. Arnold, that once again, previous month's jobs numbers were adjusted down? Like for 3-4 months in a row, they give us this number, what the jobs numbers are, and I said, oh, well, it's not great, but it's better than, and then you find out a month later, oh, we were wrong about that. Why does that keep happening? And why does it keep happening in one direction?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, the economy is a little bit weaker than Joe Biden would have you believe. But second, I think this is a lesson in ways that you should manage expectations. You shouldn't spike the football every time a favorable report comes out because they are subject to revisions. More data comes in, they refine these numbers, they change them. This happens across the board with government reports. We see that with GDP reports when they come out. So, yeah, you need to be a little bit more cautious and guarded when you're celebrating these victories, which aren't really huge victories, as you allude to here. Unemployment is up, jobs are still being created, but it is a very weird economy, as you kind of said there. It's a weird economy and one which I think could take a turn for the worse in the not too distant future.
Well, and this idea that jobs have been created, isn't it true that the vast majority of jobs that were created during this presidency were really jobs that had existed until the government literally made it illegal to go to work during the pandemic? All we did to create these jobs was to no longer make it illegal to get in the car and go work at your office.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's one of the areas that's really frustrating to hear him go out there and talk about how he's a job creating president. Yeah, we killed jobs. We literally killed jobs by preventing businesses from opening their doors. Of course, they're not going to have employees. Once we allowed them to reopen their doors, they hired again. They brought people back. They created jobs. So it's a complete canard. It's really ridiculous for the president to even say it. It's the same story when he talks about deficit reduction. He reduced the deficit. All he did was allow government programs that were built to get us through the pandemic to expire. And when they expired, we stopped spending quite as much money. Now, since then, he has passed a number of massive bills that have increased spending and driven up deficits dramatically. So he's not really out there singing that tune quite so much anymore.
The president also continues to say, and I heard him say it at his Labor Day speech there in front of a lot of organized labor members who were voluntold to show up for his speech, that he didn't raise taxes on anyone earning less than $400,000. He says it all the time. You're the vice president of the National Taxpayers Union. Is that true?
No, I don't think so. Listen, we get really clever in Washington. We try to, choose our words in a very misleading fashion. And I think that's what he's doing here. We've seen a massive tax increases under this president. He's raised taxes on corporations. He's increased tariffs, both tariffs that manufacturers are primarily paying, as well as U.S. consumers. And when you raise those taxes, whether you want to call them an income tax directly or you want to call them indirect taxes or taxes that have second-order effects, the net effect is the same. People are paying more to the federal government than they used to. Mm-hmm. And that is really problematic anytime as a proponent of low taxes, but particularly at this time when we have rampant inflation. Inflation has come down, but remember, it's cumulative. So we still have prices that are much higher than they were pre-pandemic. So when you're dealing with this really tough inflation situation, you're raising prices directly or indirectly in the form of higher tariffs and higher taxes. That's a recipe for really problematic policy. It's a recipe for a lot of struggling families and small businesses.
So in other words, I just want to play this out so everybody understands. He raises tariffs or he raises taxes on corporations. Of course, corporations don't pay taxes. They pass it on in the cost of their goods or services. So let's say you go to buy a car. And because of tariffs and because of corporate taxes, that car now costs $3,000 more than it did before the Biden administration raised those taxes and tariffs. Are you allowed to say, wait a minute, I don't make $400,000, so can I get the old price of this car?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not the case. And indeed, a lot of these taxes hit lower income Americans much harder because they can't afford that additional burden. That extra $1,000 or $3,000 hits that middle income taxpayer, that lower income taxpayer, way harder than somebody that's making well into the six figures. They can absorb that additional shock. So yeah, when we raise the price of steel, aluminum, tin. All of those things result in higher prices of fruits, vegetables, automobiles, you name it, that fall on the middle class.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they're the ones that usually take it on the chin, unfortunately.
And of course, energy costs affect literally every good and service. And I've got to think gasoline prices are going to affect lower income people more because they're in more labor intensive and service related jobs. They can't say, yeah, you know what, I'll just zoom into work 2 days a week and save myself the gas money. No, they're blue collar workers. They got to be there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And they're not buying the Teslas and fancy EVs that Biden wants us to all purchase. These are blue collar Americans, roll up their sleeves, get to work types of people that often are driving older cars. If you don't have as much money, oftentimes you're driving that older car. It may not consume gasoline quite as efficiently, so that can hit you even more acutely than it would hit somebody in a brand new EV or hybrid or what have you. So we need to be a little bit more mindful as we craft policy of who these policies actually impact. And again, it's usually the lower income Americans and the middle class Americans that struggle the most when prices increase and when taxes increase, even if, as Biden says, we're not increasing taxes directly on them, we're not raising their income taxes. They're still paying a higher price when they purchase just about everything.
Well, as you know, here in Washington, D.C., we're not allowed to have any kind of conversation, whether it's at a pub or at a ball game, or certainly about policies like this, Mr. Arnold, without shooting it through the prism of next year's presidential election. So given that, and given the mixed economic messages that the American people are hearing, what's going to be the overriding theme, do you think, going into the presidential election? What the president is saying, what people in the media are spinning, or what the actual taxpayer is feeling, what the voter is feeling, because they know everything costs a lot more than it used to.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because I was actually just sifting through some poll data, and it says that Americans are really focused on economic issues more than they normally would be. So the kitchen table issues right now are primarily things like inflation. Biden passed this massive Inflation Reduction Act. It was the worst named legislation in our nation's history. He's even gone back and said, I wish I didn't call it that because it's not actually reducing inflation. But that's what Americans are concerned about. And more than ever, I think they're concerned about how much this government is spending. We're looking down the barrel of $2 trillion deficits in the very near future here. Congress has completely mismanaged. The president has completely mismanaged the nation's finances. And Americans are paying the price for that. They're paying the price in terms of higher inflation, and they're paying the price in terms of passing down this debt to our future generations, to our children and grandchildren, who will have to pay higher taxes. And I think we are having kind of a wrecking period right now where we're realizing these are not sustainable economic policies. We need a president who will change the narrative in Washington and begin to act in a more fiscally responsible way. And hopefully that will manifest itself in Republican debates as well as what Biden is saying out on the side.
We did see it in the first Republican debate. I'd expect to see it again. However, Mr. Arnold, are Republicans vulnerable on this, and specifically President Trump, considering the spending that was done, whether it was appropriate or not because of the pandemic, but the spending went through the roof in that final year of President Trump's administration?
You're absolutely right. And even prior to the pandemic, we had a debt ceiling crisis before the pandemic. And the solution that Republicans, including President Trump, supported was raising spending by a few $100 billion in exchange for lifting that debt ceiling. A very different conversation that we had a few months ago when we actually cut spending modestly, but we moved in the right direction, at least during the passage of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which raised the debt ceiling. So yeah, I think Republicans are exposed on this, and Republicans have a mediocre record at best. Democrats have a horrible record, but there haven't really been great instances of leadership from either party when it comes to managing our nation's finances. That needs to change because, again, Americans are watching this issue, and I think they're doing so much more closely than they have historically.
I think you're right. I think, though, their instinct is that sort of a pox on both your houses sort of feeling. That said, comparing administrations, how much did it cost to fill your car up with gas during Trump, and how much does it cost now? That's a pretty tangible message, and I think that all Americans are feeling it. We got to leave it there. Thanks for an insightful conversation, Mr. Arnold, Brandon Arnold, National Taxpayers Union. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
There's more to come. I want you to keep